Good evening and welcome to this Mercy Night. We do not have a handout tonight because I'm going to be talking about chapter 1 of the book that we gave you guys all this year. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to begin to read it, but it is an excellent, deep book on Eucharist. As I was reading through the book, one of the things that grabbed me from the very beginning, the whole idea is to establish how to become a Eucharistic people. And our wonderful author here takes an entire first chapter to explain what you would need to do that. Culture. Now, John Paul II made a distinction between society and culture. I think it's important for us to hear this, because you will hear preachers talk about being countercultural as a thing that Christians and Catholics ought to do. And what they mean by that is that you should not just blindly follow the ordinary course of what our collective human experience tells you to do. But instead, you should be willing to deviate from the general norms in order to pursue what is good and true. John Paul II said, if you have authentic culture, you don't need to do that. And in fact, what he said is this is the difference between culture and society. Culture is the best of what human beings have to offer. It is the collected wisdom, practices, guidance of a group of people. It is not merely the current hot trend. That's by definition not culture. Culture, by definition, is what is distinctive about a group of people that is handed on from generation to generation to generation. It's the stuff that doesn't change, not the stuff that does. And his argument, John Paul II said, what you're talking about there is the difference between culture and society. We also hear the idea of cultural Catholics or cultural Jews, cultural Christians, or cultural Muslims. And in fact, the author goes so far to say, in what struck me as an incredibly brilliant and not so bold, but once you understand the language of it, common sense idea. In fact, cultural Catholics, as we understand in common parlance, are those Catholics who are Catholic in name only, or they participate in a handful of the things throughout the year. Maybe Easter, maybe Lent, maybe Christmas, but they pick and choose. And in fact, this is not what Catholic culture would tell you to do. And in fact, these cultural Catholics are by definition uncultured Catholics. They don't have the Catholic culture in them. Culture is like a common expression of language. It's like a dialect. And when you don't have it, and you are with the group of, this is why when you go to Boston, everybody sounds funny. And when they come here, we all sound funny, right? Because we don't share the same dialect. There's something that's almost difficult to grasp that is either present or missing. And when it's missing, it's conspicuous by its absence. Or when it's present, it's distracting by its presence. Almost like when there's an unknown spice in a food and you spend this time just, what is that? What is that? Now, I watched a program some number of years ago on the Marines, the American Marine Corps. And they kept saying this thing that grabbed me. One of the goals of the basic training for the Marines is to build a warrior ethos. It's to build in the man the virtues of a Marine warrior, which is why, amongst the branches of the American military, the Marines kind of stand out as being very different And they are very proud of this. The Marines are as proud of being Marines as Texans are proud of being from Texas. And it comes from the culture of the Marines. So what does it mean to be a cultural Catholic, or a Catholic imbibed in Catholic culture? I'm sure some of you already know this story, but do you guys know that the Catholic Church alone in the city of Chicago forced a major corporation to make a massive change in their entire structure and policy? There's a piece of that just makes me go, yeah. Now, of course, what I'm referring to is the Filet-O-Fish sandwich at McDonald's. That only exists because McDonald's franchises in the city of Chicago were losing so much money that they had to do something. It was actually kind of a known issue, and so not only was the main franchisee, the main owner of McDonald's, working on the no meat problem, but the Chicago franchisees were definitely working on that problem. There's a very funny story about a competition to see who would sell the most units. Wasn't even close, and that's why we have the Filet-O-Fish sandwich. That is because Catholics in the city of Chicago, every Friday, not during Lent, every Friday, did not eat meat. And so they would not eat at McDonald's because McDonald's did not offer an entree item that was not meat. And there were so many Catholics, it was such a large portion of the market in Chicago that they had to do something about it. Now that is not the most holy example, but it is an awesome example of the power of culture to force change. So, what is our Catholic culture? What does it mean? Often it's the stuff that you don't necessarily think about. It's things you've always done. The backbone of Catholic culture is, of course, the Eucharist. That's the whole reason that Dr. O'Malley is writing this book, is a restoration of Catholic culture surrounding the Blessed Sacrament, the Eucharist. A lot revolves around the Eucharist. Obviously, the Sunday Mass attendance is about the Eucharist. Even if you're not receiving communion at the Sunday Mass, Mass always revolves around the Eucharist, our weekly gathering together. Many of you participate in daily Mass. It's a daily interaction with the Eucharist. Many of you are members, or at least participate in our Perpetual Adoration Chapel, our relatively Perpetual Adoration Chapel. We're still working on getting back to full 24 hours. We do the Stations of the Cross. Before Mass, we pray the Rosary. Now we've begun celebrating the Liturgy of the Hours in a wider swath throughout our community. We have this piece of Eucharistic adoration that joins us during the penitential seasons and at other times when such a thing is called for. Again, for generations, hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, Catholics have participated in weekly fasting and abstinence. Fasting generally on Wednesdays in order to feel the suffering, feel the hunger, live in solidarity with the poor. Abstinence from meat on Fridays, again, every Friday, not just during Lent. Not because that is difficult. That has never been difficult. It is a sacrifice, most certainly. It is inconvenient, most certainly. But people have had good food all over the whole planet. And even if it's not our wonderful fried and boiled seafood, which is as much a cultural treasure of Louisiana as it is a convenient way to celebrate the requirement, India has vegetarian food all the time. I suspect they eat the same curry on Friday as they eat on Thursday. But on Friday, they abstain from meat because it's what Catholics do. It's not about how hard it is. None of this is all that hard at all. It's about us doing it together and about rising to the challenge. It is inconvenient. Let yourself feel the rub. prayer and fasting, almsgiving, whether annually or weekly or however is between you and the Lord. The practice of generosity and charity is part of Catholic culture. Catholic culture, the care of those who are misfortunate and the poor, has created the largest system of schools and universities, hospitals and nursing homes, and places of cultural relevancy. If I wouldn't try and use fancy words, I wouldn't trip over them when I talk. By these points of cultural relevancy, I'm actually talking about our churches and basilicas. No other organization on the planet takes care of so many historic pieces of art, or become places where anybody can gather and congregate for comfort, quiet, solitude, beauty, education, community, and most importantly, culture. Our Catholic culture has collected over 4,000 years of human wisdom in the Western intellectual tradition. Now, many of you will know that 4,000 years is longer than the existence of the Catholic Church. Yes. That is because of the adoption of Western philosophy into the understanding of Catholic theology. The adoption of a Jewish way of thinking, and obviously the Hebrew Scriptures, all of which is our patrimony in the Western world. This is the whole Christian Catholic thing. That is our culture. There is certainly more. We discover new things all the time. One of the beauties of having a truly global church is that it is unlikely that you have encountered every aspect of Catholicism. Highly unlikely. Because Catholicism here in Thibodeau is different than Catholicism in Esquipulas, Guatemala, or Managua, Nicaragua, or Paris, or London, or Rome, or Jerusalem, or Beijing. Pick any of the far-flung corners of the world, and there are Catholics there who celebrate their Catholicism with a unique local flavor that is at the same time a rich part of Catholicism and an irreplaceable component of what Jesus Christ is already trying to do. The great variety is incredibly profound. Whether it is the simplicity of Irish Catholicism that has always sort of been under persecution, or the very vibrant and alive Catholicism under the thumb of real martyrdom, the church in China, Central America, Africa, all of those places where people are dying today for our faith. Whether it's the tactile faith of Central America. When I first arrived at my hospital that I was doing chaplaincy work in at the end of my second year of theology, graduate school, I couldn't figure out why the hands of all the statues were broken. At first, I was like, this is Chicago, right? We can't have nice things here. Turns out, it wasn't the unruly rival gangs of the city that were breaking the statues. It was the largest Puerto Rican collection of Puerto Ricans outside of Puerto Rico is in the city of Chicago. And they have a 50-foot tall metal Puerto Rican flag marking the opening of their neighborhood. It is incredibly impressive. They were the ones breaking the hands of the statues. Not out of anger or mistrust, but out of piety, which is a difficult thing to begin to understand. But part of the tactile nature of the way they live faith is you pray by holding the hands of the statues, which invariably would break the statues. That's all it was. And I'm sure that the hospital had replaced multiple statues, and after a while just went, you know what, we're not doing that no more. Maybe every once in a while we'll glue something back on with super glue, but I'm just going to leave it the way it is because it's just going to keep breaking. That tactile faith are the ancient faith of the city of Rome. Some places in Spain, France, and Great Britain that have had the Catholic faith almost from the very beginning, if not from the very beginning. The Stations of the Cross were a natural development of Catholic piety in the city of Rome. You would go to the different churches and pray. It didn't start in Jerusalem, although it is a big part of Jerusalem's Catholic identity now. And you would go to the stations, the station churches. And you would go and visit 7 or 10 or something like that churches on Good Friday. It was an all-day thing. Because, churches are kind of far apart in the city of Rome and everything is on foot. The Rosary was a natural development of Catholic piety. It was only after the Rosary already began to exist as a natural development of the Liturgy of the Hours, which was a natural development of the people's desire to fulfill St. Paul's exhortation to pray always without ceasing. It was only after the Rosary was well established that Our Lady appeared to St. Dominic and told him to add a few little things to it and to spread the devotion. The Rosary, in a fairly modern form, already existed before anybody from heaven showed up to give divine revelation or inspiration about it. It was a piece of authentic Catholic culture. Now, I want you to hear that this is not human beings creating something that didn't exist. God calls man first. Catechism says that. Our first reaction is always a response to God's call. Catholic culture is the authentic way in which the indwelling of the Holy Spirit is lived out in the lives of our faithful. This is the kind of stuff that when you see it, you go, don't you love it? It's got gravitas to it. It's got a weight to it. That when we try and be creative and come up with new things to fill a void or a hole that we perceive, there's an emptiness there. There's a sort of like a cuteness where like you're just trying to come up with something. Greatest example of this is, of course, if any of you did this, take a deep breath, it's okay. The Unity Candle, you may be familiar with this custom, is an American wedding custom that has nothing to do with Catholicism. Actually, it has nothing to do with Christianity. It was made up whole cloth for a television soap opera, which is why it's got a sort of air of like hookiness to it. There's no weight. There's no history. There's no tradition. There's no custom. It just began to exist. And things like the lighting of an Advent wreath. There's a several hundred-year tradition there. Eucharistic adoration, what we are about to do, has a several hundred, I think it's actually over 1,000-year tradition. We didn't always do this, but that innate desire deep within us resulted in risks, opportunities, chances taken. And the result of those decisions made by good lay people and priests hundreds of years ago has resulted in this life-giving, vocation-affirming ritual. It doesn't need to exist, but it does, as God's sort of gift to us. That is what it means to have Catholic culture. If you have a chance to read the book, you really ought to. It's a great little powerful book. It won't take you very long. I wouldn't read it in one sitting, but you get a lot out of it this season.